Everyone has heard of Hamlet, William Shakespeare's tragedy of the doomed, indecisive Prince of Denmark, right? Or at least most people know the famous line, to be or not to be. But today, I don't want to talk about Hamlet the play. I want to talk about Hamnet, Maggie O'Farrell's 2020 novel and recent film adaptation by Chloe Zhao, which tells the story behind the inspiration for the play. But before I get into that, my name is Hannah. Some people talk about books, some talk about movies. I want to talk about books that became movies. And apologies, but there will be some spoilers ahead. I want to start with the book first, so let's get into it. I kept hearing people talk about this novel before I even decided to pick it up, and honestly, a lot of the hype that I heard was a big reason as to why I even decided to read it. Now, I'll admit something, I've never really read any of Shakespeare's plays, I've never even seen one. A lot of my exposure to Shakespeare comes from film adaptations or modern retellings like Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, and 10 Things I Hate About You, to name some of the popular ones. So I went into this book with no real preconceptions other than assuming I'd love it because everyone else seemed to. But here's the thing, you might think that Hamnet is largely about Shakespeare or at least about his famous play, but it's not. It doesn't focus on him, his career, or his famous works. He's not actually even named in the novel. Instead, O'Farrell's book centers on Shakespeare's family, especially his wife Agnes, and the heartache they experience when their son Hamnet's life is tragically taken by the plague. Now, that's not even a spoiler, the book tells you this in the first chapter. Focusing on Shakespeare's family makes the story feel more grounded and ultimately more relatable. While we ordinarily think of Shakespeare as this untouchable genius, the book places him far in the background. He's away in London for most of the story, actually. Now, I enjoyed O'Farrell's book, and I think one of the main reasons I liked it is because it constantly shifts between different characters' points of view. We move between Shakespeare, Agnes, Susanna, their eldest daughter, the twins Hamnet and Judith, and even smaller supporting characters like Shakespeare's parents and Agnes's brother Bartholomew. Basically, if a character is introduced, chances are you'll eventually end up inside their head. And because of that, the novel never gives you one fixed perspective of any single character or event. Instead, you see how differently people interpret one another depending on their own fears, expectations, and relationships. Agnes's character is probably one of the best examples of how differently people perceive the same person throughout the novel. Every character projects something different onto her. Take Shakespeare. Upon meeting Agnes, he is immediately fascinated by her in a way that feels almost all-consuming. She's slightly older than him, which already places her outside the expectations of the time, but it's much more than that. Agnes lives on the edge of town with her stepmother and siblings, is skilled with herbs and folk remedies, and seems to possess a nearly supernatural ability to read people. A lot of her neighbors think she's a witch, or at least something suspiciously close to it. And then there's the kestrel that Agnes trains and cares for. Now, this is a small aside, but the movie actually uses a Harris's hawk instead of a kestrel, and this is largely because hawks are much easier to train. However, experts were somewhat upset by this change as it is historically inaccurate, since Harris's hawks were not introduced to England until centuries after Shakespeare's death. But anyway, owning a kestrel would have been deeply unusual for a woman of her social position in Elizabethan England. Kestrels were generally associated with nobility, status, and masculine authority as they were commonly trained in falconry. The kestrel immediately becomes symbolic of Agnes herself, a bit wild, difficult to control, and fundamentally unsuited to domestic confinement. But Shakespeare is captivated by this. To him, Agnes represents freedom, intuition, and a kind of emotional intensity that doesn't exist within his parents' rigid household. Shakespeare's parents, on the other hand, interpret Agnes's qualities completely differently. They see Agnes as strange, socially inappropriate, and almost childish because she doesn't typically behave according to the expectations placed on women at the time. They constantly underestimate her intelligence because her knowledge is practical, emotional, and instinctive rather than formal or academic. Even the way that they speak to Agnes is often patronizing, as though they're trying to domesticate her. And this contrast in perception is really what gives the novel its emotional weight. Plot-wise, Hamnet is actually pretty simple. It's about Shakespeare's family, the plague eventually reaching their home, and the devastating loss of their son. The novel isn't driven by suspense or major twists. Its impact comes from the differing viewpoints within the family and how each character deals with intense grief. O'Farrell's prose is also really accessible, which I always appreciate, so the book feels literary without being overly dense. O'Farrell's writing is very descriptive and atmospheric, with a lot of the emotional weight coming from small details and observations rather than dramatic scenes or dialogue. There are passages in the book that are absolutely beautiful and captivating. The section where Agnes is consumed by grief and begins thinking about all of the things that Hamnet will never experience, the life that he will never get to live, was emotionally wrenching. O'Farrell writes those moments with such rawness and precision that the grief almost stops feeling like fiction. That kind of writing forces you to reflect on your own experiences of loss or the fear of loss, and personally, I'm lucky enough to have barely experienced real grief in my own life, yet those passages still hit me incredibly hard. Those sections about grief were probably the point where the emotional weight of the novel landed most successfully for me. However, there were other times where O'Farrell's storytelling didn't quite land for me. Now, I didn't major in English literature, so maybe take that with a grain of salt. One scene that really stuck with me, and not in a good way, is when Agnes and Shakespeare are intimate for the first time in the Apple storeroom. O'Farrell describes this act as prosaic, a physiological function rather than romantic or erotic. This is because Agnes is focused on securing her marriage to Shakespeare, and this act, and ultimately her pregnancy, serves this purpose. O'Farrell leans into natural imagery, with Agnes comparing the lovemaking to the sensation of a lamb slithering wet from a ewe. Yeah, I did not like that. And the constant detail of the apples bouncing around also made it really uncomfortable to read. Overall, I would give Maggie O'Farrell's Hamnet a 7 out of 10. I enjoyed the book, I'd recommend it, but it's not something I think I would go back to, not anytime soon anyways. Her book is quite slow and reflective, so it really asks you to sit with the emotions instead of pushing the story forward, and I think I prefer more plot-driven books, hence my rating. Now let's move on to Chloe Zhao's 2025 film adaptation, because this is where I think things get a little bit more interesting. While watching this movie, I couldn't stop picking out the differences from O'Farrell's novel, things that were excluded from the book or things that were created just for the movie. One of the biggest differences between the book and the film is the way the creators treat Shakespeare as a character. In the novel, Shakespeare is pushed to the background. O'Farrell focuses much more on Agnes, the children, and other members of the family, making the story feel less about Shakespeare's legacy and more about family, grief, and emotional absence. The film, however, brings Shakespeare much closer to the center of the narrative, and in doing so, reshapes the way the audience interprets him. In Zhao's adaptation, we see him playing with his children, shielding Hamnet from Shakespeare's abusive father, and behaving like a deeply devoted husband. We even see the children recite for him famous lines from his iconic plays. Through those scenes, the audience comes to see Shakespeare as taking an active role as a father and husband. He's loving, attentive, and emotionally available. So when he leaves his family for his work in London, there is this sense that he has to leave, but it pains him every time. Bye. This felt very Hollywood to me, but I actually didn't mind that. From their initial introductions, the movie portrays the main characters in a sympathetic light, and this creates a more conventional family dynamic, almost an idealized version of familial love. And this serves Zhao's purpose, to make the emotional climax land much harder with the audience. To be fair, the Hollywood treatment works. By the end of the film, the audience is devastated, sharing the pain of Hamnet's loss with every member of the family, notably Shakespeare. I say notably because this is so different from his portrayal in the book. As O'Farrell tells it, with Shakespeare's constant absences, it was almost impossible for me to find him sympathetic at all. He leaves for London constantly, and when Shakespeare does return home, just missing a chance to say goodbye to his dying son, he is home very briefly before he leaves for London again. The reader sees how isolating and confusing it is for Agnes to witness her husband's seemingly very brief mourning period, and after Shakespeare's quick departure, he barely writes to his family and he barely visits. So Agnes is now left in this sort of emotional limbo. She is grieving, but she must maintain the appearance of a functioning marriage while privately questioning whether the relationship still exists at all. And we see this throughout the story. Almost 2 years, I believe, Susanna, the eldest daughter, begins taking over as head of the household because Agnes has retreated into her grief. Shakespeare does return eventually, but that's when it becomes clear that he has been unfaithful in his time away from his family. During his visit, he brings Agnes a gift, a bracelet, but when she puts it on, she immediately senses that it had been worn by another woman, and Agnes pulls away even further. That scene really changed the way that I viewed Shakespeare in the book. Up until that point, I could kind of empathize to some extent with his distant behavior because I understand that grief can completely consume a person and even change the way that they interact with others. I'm also aware that in the 17th century, wives weren't in a position to object to their situations or their husband's bad behavior. However, we see that Agnes was really upset by Shakespeare's infidelity, and although he apologizes and Agnes forgives him, I never really got the sense that he mends his ways. So, as a 21st century reader, it was very hard for me to sympathize with physical and emotional abandonment, and infidelity on top of that. So from that point in the book forward, I viewed Shakespeare with a certain amount of contempt. Even in the end, where Agnes realizes how much Hamnet's death has been weighing on her husband, I couldn't regain any concern for his feelings. Now, truthfully, the film adaptation glosses over a lot of O'Farrell's descriptions of a distant, self-centered Shakespeare. Yes, it's very Hollywood, and maybe this is an unpopular opinion, but this difference is actually one of the things that I really liked about the movie, where the novel left me feeling a bit cold. Shakespeare takes up much more of the movie adaptation than he does the book, and there are many scenes of Shakespeare enjoying time with family or grieving his son's loss while away in London. So ultimately, the film makes Shakespeare much more compassionate, likable, and fitting better with our expectations of him. Another difference between the book and the movie was the treatment of the bond between the twins, Judith and Hamnet. Relatively early on in the movie, we see the interchangeability of the twins symbolized as they swap places with each other as a practical joke on their parents. And we see Hamnet switch places with Judith again to trick Death when the plague is about to take her life. So yes, in both versions, we see the inexhaustible love that Hamnet has for Judith that drives him to sacrifice himself for her. In the movie, though, the audience doesn't experience all of the grief that Judith suffers after Hamnet's death the way that they do in the book. This is because the novel presents the twins as two halves of the same person, and after Hamnet dies, Judith experiences his absence physically. She doesn't just grieve him emotionally, she feels physically incomplete without him, as though part of her own identity has disappeared. The readers watch Judith wander through the family home searching for traces of him, revisiting places associated with his death, and trying to sense some lingering presence. And honestly, I think this is one devastating aspect of the novel that could have been explored just a little bit more in the film. Another interesting difference that I noticed between the novel and the film is the way they use animal imagery to create completely different emotional tones. The book focuses heavily on a flea, this tiny carrier of disease and death, while the film places far more emphasis on Agnes's bird, the Harris's hawk. And I think that contrast really reflects the emotional differences between the two versions of the story. The novel feels much darker and more fatalistic, whereas the film leans more toward healing, memory, and hope. In the book, O'Farrell traces a flea's movement across continents and trade routes before it eventually reaches the family home in Stratford. The flea's odyssey occupies the middle to end of the novel and works almost like an explanatory interlude, with O'Farrell showing how the infection physically makes its way into the household. So even though the readers already know from the book's outset that Hamnet will die from the plague, the account of the flea's journey still creates this overwhelming sense of inevitability of the infection and the death that follows. Now, I got really sucked into this section of the story because the flea almost becomes a symbol of fate itself. It's this near invisible hitchhiker traveling undetected across oceans to bring catastrophe to this one family. And if you know anything about the Black Death, this detail alerts you to the scale of suffering the family will face. The swellings associated with bubonic plague are incredibly painful, which makes you so much more empathetic to Agnes and Hamnet. Hamnet because he suffers, and Agnes because she has to watch and can't do anything about it. So to me, the flea is more than just a plot device. It symbolizes doom, inevitability, and the random cruelty of disease. It's such a dark image, and I kept wondering how the film would adapt it. Would Zhao turn it into some kind of montage similar to the bat to pig to human sequence depicted in the movie Contagion, or would it become a thread woven throughout the film? Instead, to my surprise, Zhao omits the flea storyline from the movie altogether. Rather than highlighting the journey of one of the Black Death's tiny agents the way the novel does, Zhao simply displays the plague's presence with evidence of its handiwork. Our first hint of this is during a brief scene in London where Shakespeare comes across a shadow puppet performance that depicts the spread of infection and death. This depiction is very similar to the flea's journey, but minus the flea. Then we see Shakespeare walking the streets of London where it feels like the plague is closing in around him. The scenes are dark and grey with masked plague doctors in almost every shot. In this way, the film still creates this dark, foreboding atmosphere, but it feels somewhat more background. It's less malevolent and less inevitable than in the novel's approach. And I think the reason for that becomes clearer when you compare the flea's absence to the role of the hawk in the movie adaptation. In the novel, Agnes's kestrel is mostly associated with her earlier life before marriage. After she marries Shakespeare, the kestrel goes to live with the priest who originally gifted it to her as a child. From that moment on, the kestrel largely disappears from the story, apart from an occasional mention that Agnes still visits it. The separation between Agnes and the kestrel in the novel feels symbolic. Before marriage, the kestrel represents her freedom, independence, and untamable nature, the parts of herself that exist outside social expectations. But after marriage, that connection is severed as she becomes increasingly tied to domestic responsibilities and motherhood. So the film changes the hawk's role significantly, allowing the symbolism it represents to continue throughout the story. In the movie, her hawk, not kestrel, becomes closely connected to Agnes's spirituality, her relationship with nature, and eventually the film's acceptance of death itself. When her hawk does unfortunately pass away, the film turns it into this really quiet but emotional moment. Agnes gathers her family together and treats the hawk's death with genuine care and reverence, teaching her children to see death as something natural rather than something that's terrifying. And by the end of the film, the hawk almost comes to symbolize release or transcendence, the idea that love and memory can continue beyond physical death. And I think that's a key contrast between O'Farrell's novel and Zhao's film. In the book, the flea represents inevitability, suffering, and the randomness of tragedy. In the film, the hawk represents memory, spiritual connection, and hope. One pulls the story toward darkness and doom, the other pulls it toward healing and emotional release. Finally, I also want to talk about a storyline that only exists in the movie, and that is the tale of Orpheus and Eurydice. Early on in the film, during one of Shakespeare's first interactions with Agnes, he's kind of awkward and admits he's not great at talking to people. He says he's more of a storyteller, so she asks him to tell her a story instead. And the story that he tells her is the Greek tragedy of Orpheus and Eurydice. Now, at first, I thought this story felt quite random, a non sequitur, but as the film goes on, I realize the myth quietly sets up the audience for the emotional climax of the story. Orpheus and Eurydice is about love, grief, and trying to hold on to someone after death. Orpheus loses his lover Eurydice and travels to the underworld to persuade Hades to release her. Now, Orpheus is a famed musician and he plays for Hades and his denizens of the underworld. And Hades is so moved by Orpheus's music that he grants his request on one condition, that Orpheus not look back until he has reached the living world. Unfortunately, before Orpheus returns to the surface, he is overcome by curiosity and turns to see if Eurydice is following him. But to his horror, when he looks behind him, he sees Eurydice pulled back to the underworld forever. And that dynamic, love, grief, and trying to hold on to someone after death, is an underlying theme of the story. There's a somewhat subtle reference to the Greek tragedy during their wedding when Agnes tells Shakespeare to turn and look at her.
Look at me.
But the reference is much more prominent and much more meaningful by the end of the film.
Look at me.
After Hamnet's death, Agnes is outraged when she learns from family that her husband is staging a play, Hamlet, named after their son. She decides to travel to London to see it, anticipating that her husband is exploiting their son's death and their family's grief. But as she watches the play, she sees her son and the actor playing Hamlet on stage, and realizes that her husband has been grieving just as deeply as she has.
My boy.
She realizes that through the play, Shakespeare is trying to preserve Hamlet's memory and ultimately bring him back to life, much like Orpheus did with Eurydice. That's when all of the emotions that were built up from the very beginning of the story to the final performance really hit me. Agnes finally realizes that Shakespeare has been grieving too, just differently. She processes grief through silence and emotion, while he processes through stories and performance. So at the end of the movie, those references to Orpheus and Eurydice don't feel random at all. As it turns out, the film was telling us from the very beginning what this story was really about. I honestly feel like I could keep talking about the differences between the book and the movie for another 3 hours, but I should probably wrap this up before this video becomes longer than Hamlet itself. But before I do that, I just really need to quickly highlight how incredible the performances in this film were. Everyone is fantastic, but Jessie Buckley as Agnes and Jacoby Jupe as Hamnet were just absolutely phenomenal. I knew coming out of the movie that Jessie Buckley was going to be nominated for Best Actress for this movie, and I'm so glad that she won it because she really deserved the award. Also, visually, this movie is just stunning. The cinematography is gorgeous, but it's not pretty for the sake of being pretty. So much of the imagery and symbolism, like the hawk, the shadows, the repeated references to death and performance, all felt incredibly deliberate. Another small aside, but I also found out afterwards that Jacoby Jupe's older brother actually played the stage version of Hamlet in the film, and it all just felt so perfect. It really shows how much care and thought went into this adaptation and how committed Zhao was to honoring the novel. Now, for the big question, did I prefer the book or the movie? Surprisingly, I think I liked the movie slightly more. I'd probably give it an 8 out of 10. Some of the changes that Zhao made that initially frustrated me actually made more sense the longer I sat with the film adaptation. Removing or reducing certain parts helped move the story along, and a lot of what Zhao added elevated the emotional core of the story in a really beautiful way. Now, I did think that some moments of the film were a little melodramatic or even cliche, like the idealized portrayal of family or the scene where Agnes reaches out to touch the hand of the actor playing Hamlet on stage. But honestly, those moments also really worked for me. When Agnes touches Hamlet's hand and then the audience around her begins reaching out too, I genuinely started ugly crying. And then when Agnes looks around and realizes that she is not alone in her grief anymore, that other people understand this pain too, the audience knows that this is the closure she needed to be able to move on. I also loved the way the film tied everything back to Orpheus and Eurydice. By the end, it becomes clear that the movie isn't really just about death. It's about the ways people try to preserve the people they love, through memory, through storytelling, and through art. So even though the pacing of the movie is kind of slow at times and some of the dialogue becomes repetitive, the movie still captures the emotional essence of the book while also becoming something distinct in its own right. And ultimately, the film just hit me much harder emotionally than O'Farrell's story. People always say the book is better than the movie, but in this particular instance, I do disagree. Slightly. If you've read Hamnet or watched the film, I would genuinely love to know what you all thought, and whether you preferred the book or the adaptation. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe because I definitely want to keep posting videos just like this one. Thanks so much for watching!